Welcome to the Aerospace Advantage podcast, brought to you by PenFed. I'm your host, Heather Lucky Penney. Here on the Aerospace Advantage, we speak with leaders in the DoD, industry, and other subject matter experts to explore the intersection of strategy, operational concepts, technology, and policy when it comes to air and space power. Space is an ever-growing part of our daily life. Everything from GPS-enabled navigation, logistics, and even radio and television requires the use of space-based technology. For our military, every service and combatant command depends on space in some way to fulfill their missions. It's critical for activities like command and control, missile launch detection, and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, even dropping bombs on target. In short, to secure our nation, maintaining space superiority is a necessity. But while our freedom to operate in space is critical, today it's under ever-increasing threat. Adversaries like China and Russia recognize how much we depend on space, and they've been building up the capabilities to deny us access. Space today is now a warfighting domain. Achieving and maintaining space superiority will require the effort of all services and combatant commands. So for today's episode, it's my pleasure to welcome three guests who will discuss our newest report, Charting a Path to Space Superiority, the Cross-Domain Imperative. And this report looks at how the U.S. must adapt to meet the challenges of the new operating environment in space. So, we're delighted to have Jennifer Boots Reeves, the author of this report. Boots is, as you know, a senior fellow for Spacepower Studies at the Mitchell Institute Spacepower Advantage Center of Excellence, MySpace. Boots, it's so great to have you back on the podcast to discuss your first major report, and congratulations.
Oh, Lucky, thanks so much. It's great to be back, and I'm so excited to talk about this work, especially because space is no longer a niche issue. It's foundational to how the joint force fights today.
Yeah, no, it matters to all of us. So I'm also pleased to introduce our guest, Major General Anthony Mastalir. General Mastalir is the Director of Global Space Operations, Headquarters U.S. Space Command at Peterson Space Force Base in Colorado. He's responsible for executing operations within the U.S. Space Command area of responsibility and integrating military space power across all warfighting domains. And before his current posting, General Mastalir was the commander of U.S. Space Forces Indo-Pacific. General Mastalir, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Lucky and Boots. Charles, I'm delighted to be here with all of you. This is a great event, so I appreciate being allowed to participate.
Spoiler alert, Charles Galbreath, also senior resident fellow for, director of MySpace.
Yep. Thanks, Lucky. Great to be with you. And Chachi, it's great to see you again. And Jen, congratulations on the paper.
All right, so Boots, we're going to kick things off with you because your report has really, I think, set the stage for what needs to happen for space superiority. But members of our audience who haven't had the chance yet to read it, can you break it down for us?
Sure, I'm happy to. So at its core, this report starts from a pretty simple but urgent premise. Space superiority is no longer guaranteed. And the way the Department of Defense has historically approached space is just no longer sufficient for the threat environment we're facing today. So for decades, the United States has benefited from essentially uncontested access to space. Space systems have enabled everything from GPS to communications, missile warning, and intelligence. And they've worked so reliably that we've come to treat them like as a given. Space became a supporting function that everyone relies on, but very few people actively have been thinking about defending it. So that changed decisively in 2007 when China destroyed a satellite with an anti-satellite missile. That moment marked the transition into what I like to think of as the current space age, one where space is truly no longer a sanctuary, but a contested warfighting domain. Since then, China and Russia are both fielding a wide range of counter-space capabilities designed to target not just our satellites, but the entire space architecture. One of the key points in the report is that space systems aren't just about things on orbit. They're made up of three segments: the orbital segment, the terrestrial segment, and the link segment that connects them. Those segments exist across every warfighting domain: air, land, sea, cyber, and of course space, which means both our vulnerabilities and our opportunities span the joint force. That leads to the central argument of the report, that achieving space superiority is not solely a Space Force problem. Every service already fields capabilities that can help defend U.S. space systems or hold adversary space systems at risk. The challenge isn't so much inventing entirely new tools, it's about integrating what we already have. But the integration requires unity of effort. Cross-domain operations in support of space superiority must be centrally directed, and that means U.S. Space Command has to be able to function as a supported command, with other services and combatant commands providing forces and effects in support. So to make that shift real, the report lays out 4 interdependent lines of effort. First, we need a clear roles and missions review across the entire space enterprise. Second, we must invest in cross-domain capabilities and capacity, not just satellites, although we need plenty of those, but the systems that protect and connect them. Third, we have to improve space education across all the services because most warfighters don't fully understand how dependent they are on space or how they can help defend it. And finally, we have to train more the way like we expect to fight by routinely exercising contested space scenarios and those new command relationships that I talk about. So the bottom line is this: space superiority underpins everything that the Joint Force does. And if we want to deter conflict and win if deterrence fails, we have to start treating space as a warfighting mission that the entire Joint Force is responsible for supporting.
Boots, thanks for that summary. It was really great. You know, at the heart of it, your report digs into this issue about thinking of space as a supported domain versus just simply supporting. Can you explain what you mean by this distinction?
Yeah, so when we say that space has historically been supporting, what we mean is that space has existed by and large to enable operations in other domains. GPS has supported maneuver. Satellites have supported communications. ISR supports targeting. What's changed, though, is that space itself is now under attack. And that means we can no longer assume those enabling effects will just be there. Space has become something that we must actively defend and, if necessary, fight to regain. So treating space as sort of a supported domain, or think about it, the space leadership organizations as the supported leadership and organizations, means recognizing that there will be times when other forces, air, land, maritime, cyber, must conduct operations specifically to protect space systems or deny an adversary's use of theirs. And that's not about diminishing the importance of the other domains. Of course not. It's about acknowledging that without space superiority, operations in every other domain become dramatically harder, slower, riskier, all of that.
So this seems like a major culture shift. How have our warfighters and decision makers in Washington looked at the space domain historically?
See, I think the key thing is that our habits have been rooted in an era of permissivity in the space domain, right? For decades, space has just worked so well. It's just there. We don't even think about it. And warfighters, the military just doesn't even have to think about defending it because the space effects were reliable, but invisible and assumed. Everyone assumes it's just going to be there. Adversaries, however, have not made that assumption. China and Russia, they know how dependent we are on our space and on our space capabilities, and they are deliberately building, have built, and continue to build systems to exploit our dependence. So the danger today is that if we keep treating space as sort of this background enabler and solely, like we're not giving up on that, we will continue to make sure that space is there and that we want space to enable operations, but it can't be treated, that's the only thing. We have to prioritize defending it now, not wait until it's degraded or denied, because then the operational consequences just cascade across all the domains. So this distinction now forces planners and decision makers to confront this hard reality. Space superiority can't be assumed. It has to be achieved actively.
Thank you for that foundation and that context. General Mastalir, I'd like to bring you into the conversation because you know better than most how the space environment has evolved and why this necessitates the need for change. I mean, we faced competition during the Cold War in space, the whole space race with the Soviets. How is it different today?
Yeah, thanks for that, Lucky. You're absolutely right. And I couldn't agree more with the way Boots laid out this strategic environment today. In fact, recently General Whiting was at the Space Force Association Spacepower conference, and he made some comments that at first blush might seem to be a counter narrative to this idea of space as a peaceful domain. And what he said was that this is one of the enduring myths that we must overcome. His point was, to your point, that the space age was birthed in great power competition, and in the early years it was very contested. And what has changed since then is the actors, the technologies, and the policies that shape the way we fight. For many years after the Cold War, space became a relative sanctuary, and it wasn't contested, as Boots laid out. And I think too many of us that got comfortable with the fact that space would always be available. And Boots' paper, her research, is kind of a wake-up call that we can't look at it that way anymore, because adversaries are building weapons specifically designed to take away the U.S. advantage in space. And that's something that every military commander has to contend with and has to plan for.
So, sir, before your current assignment as the J3 Space Command, you were the commander of space forces in the Indo-Pacific. And so you clearly worked very closely with the Army, Navy, and Marine counterparts in this new space environment, battle space. Do you have the impression that they understood the complexity of the evolving space environment at the same level and what it meant for their domain operations?
Yeah, so the way I would answer that is for much of my career, space was just assumed away. But that is changing. And there's a number of reasons for that. But there's a growing shift across the Joint Force, understanding the need to better integrate space-based capabilities and space warfighting into the planning considerations for operations, including their training and exercises. One example is Apollo Griffin, which is a U.S. Space Command exercise. And we run that jointly with Indo-PACOM, whose exercise is Pacific Sentry. These are both under the Joint Staff's Elite Constellation series. So this is an opportunity for Space Command as a combatant command to work very closely with another combatant command and our allies to execute command post functions, in a space potential conflict that might extend into space. Another example is our Apollo Nexus exercise, which will experiment with ways to better synchronize cyber capabilities. So that brings in U.S. Cyber Command and Global Special Operations Forces. So SOCOM, Special Operations Command, gets to play in those. So U.S. Space Command has to create this connective tissue with both, commands, functional, what we historically would call functional combatant commands like Cyber Command, as well as what we would historically refer to as geographic combatant commands like EUCOM and Indo-PACOM.
So that's really fascinating. And during Apollo Griffin and Pacific Sentry, did you see SpaceCom being supported by PACOM?
Yeah, so what's happening is with we've embedded joint integration space teams. These are Space Command representatives that we've embedded in the various geographic combatant commands. The other issue at stake here is the rise of the Space Force service components. And we can talk more about that later in the podcast, but the service components and the Space Command Joint Integrated Space Team members help raise the level of awareness and the operational imperatives within, for example, Indo-PACOM during PAC Sentry. So there's a better understanding of what needs to be done to ensure that space capabilities, whether it's terrestrial, link, or on orbit, are protected. Now, some of those capabilities are in the geographic combatant commands theater. So it's important that those commanders understand the relative value of that space enabling infrastructure and can ensure that it's defended. Does that make sense?
That's perfect. As a matter of fact, that's a great segue into the question. I wanted to bring in Boots back in, because based off of what you said to us, I'd like Boots to break down the segments of the space systems, because, sir, you had mentioned Link, the ground systems, obviously what's on orbit. And I think our audience would appreciate learning more about these segments from Boots, because this breakdown is really important in the report. And, sir, you had alluded to the combatant commands really understanding how they can target some of those elements in support of space superiority. So, Boots, can you sort of define that architecture for us?
Yeah, absolutely. And this really does take it to the super basics. Like, all of your space guys are going to know this, but your non-space guys may not know this. So it's one of the really important reframes that are in the report, right? And the key thing is that space systems, everybody thinks about it just being satellites in space, and that's just not the case. Space systems are made up of 3 interdependent segments. The orbital segment is, yes, the satellites in space. Again, what most everybody thinks about. But the second element is the terrestrial segment, right? That includes things like ground stations and radars, command and control nodes, even the users of the space services, like ships navigating with GPS or aircraft using satellite communications, that kind of thing. And then the third is the link segment. So that's the data links, the signals, the part of the spectrum that connects everything together. And the key insight here is that only one of these 3 segments of the interdependent segments actually lives in space. So the others exist across the other warfighting domains, air, land, sea, and cyber. And that means that collectively defending space or attacking the adversary space systems is inherently multi/cross domain. That's such an important reframe for the non-space people, right? The space folks already get this, but the non-space folks need to understand this, because they have absolutely ways to contribute to space superiority right there in their own domains.
Yeah, and I think that reframe is really important. And I would add to users, rather than just saying like the ships or the airplanes, it's actually, the systems, right? The GPS receivers, or how they're processing the space signals. Because, as an airman, that's a way for me to think about targeting that space system in a way that's different than shooting an AMRAAM at an airplane, or am I going to jam their GPS receiver? So that, I think, is a really interesting way to expand how we think about the users. I love how you talked about the entire systems. And that's an important piece, too, as you said earlier in your recommendations, of educating everyone across the different services about space architecture, space systems, and how we can contribute to that space superiority fight. So, General Mastalir, I'd like to dig into this a little bit deeper, because Boots laid out how achieving space superiority can really be this multi-domain endeavor. And obviously, Space Command leads the way on achieving space superiority. But as she described it, it needs help from the other combatant commands. You mentioned earlier Apollo Griffin and Pacific Sentry. Do you have any other examples that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah. So first, let me say, and Space Command is very comfortable fulfilling a supporting role to the Joint Force. We take great pride in ensuring that we're able to deliver space effects to national command authorities and Joint Force commanders. That's a no-fail mission for us. So I don't want anybody to think that we're walking away from our supporting role. But to Boots' point, there are times when U.S. Space Command may very well be the supported commander. And now you asked for some specific scenarios. The first one I'd point to is, I'd refer you to General Whiting's comments, expressing concern regarding reports over the last 2 years that Russia may be considering placing a nuclear weapon in orbit. In fact, the president signed an executive order, yesterday, doubling down on the fact that there is no way we can allow a nation to place a nuclear weapon in space. Such a weapon, if used, would have indiscriminate effects that could potentially destroy all nations' space capabilities. And it makes space unusable for potentially generations. Not to mention, it would cripple the global economy, and it's a clear violation of the Outer Space Treaty. So this is a scenario that we cannot let stand. The incredible consequence of deploying such a capability is something that would require potentially a military response. And in that scenario, U.S. Space Command commander could very well be assigned a supported role where other combatant commands would have to serve as a supporting role to ensure that we are able to neutralize that threat. And so another example I would point to, also doubled down in the president's executive order, is this idea of the General Whiting's role as the human spaceflight support manager for the Department of War. And this will come into play as we prepare for Artemis II. So what does that mean? It means that U.S. Space Command is responsible for contingency operations to rescue and recover NASA astronauts, which means that we need to posture forces, Department of War forces around the world to perform that contingency rescue of NASA-sponsored astronauts if necessary. So in that capacity, we're going to muster the resources of the Department of War, and General Whiting would be the supported commander, ensuring that the capabilities and forces from the Air Force, for example, the Guardian Angels, and the Navy and others are postured to support that mission in support of NASA. And the Department of War and before that, the Department of Defense for decades has worked very closely with NASA. So we are not strangers to this level of cooperation and collaboration, but we would run lead on those kind of missions.
Yeah. So if I could just pile on here, all of the services have space capabilities. I mean, and this is not unique to space, right? All of the services have aircraft. It's not like we consolidated all of the space capabilities within one service. But even beyond that, as Jen talked about, some of the existing traditional domain operations and capabilities can have a space effect. And so one of the analogies I want to just bring up is when we think about the space surveillance network, the things that monitor what's happening in space, there's dedicated collateral and contributing. I know the space guys are all going to go, yeah, I remember those. So a dedicated this is an asset built specifically for a space mission, for space awareness. Collateral this is a system built for another purpose, missile warning, for example, but I can use it for space domain awareness. And then finally, contributing, something completely out of the DoD, maybe a civil or a commercial capability or an international capability that can also be brought to bear. So in the same way, think of a bomber. Its primary mission is to bomb targets as part of the Air Force campaign, the Joint Air Campaign, right? But maybe that bomber can also drop a bomb on a target that is an anti-satellite direct ascent capability that the adversary might have. And doing so is defending space capabilities. It is supporting the defense of our space capabilities in a collateral way. And so I think that sort of analogy is helpful in looking at all of the capabilities that can be brought to bear from the joint perspective to support space superiority.
Well, if we're dropping bombs on anti-satellite capabilities, that is the target. I mean, that is the target.
I mean,
as an airman, I think about it differently.
The effect that it creates is a space superiority effect.
Exactly. Yeah, no, exactly.
PenFed checking and savings accounts are here for all your adventures. From,
do you take this man to be your husband?
I do.
To,
he has your eyes.
He's perfect.
Learn more at PenFed.org. Federally insured by NCUA.
So, I mean, this all brings up roles and missions. Boots, is there a clear understanding right now about who does what in a scenario?
So honestly, I don't think there is enough clarity today. And I don't think that's a criticism per se. No one has done anything wrong here, but it's a reflection of how fast things have changed in the last several years. So 6 years ago, we collectively stood up the Space Force, and we reestablished U.S. Space Command, but in a different iteration, right? As a geographic combatant command, which is new and different than what it was when it existed before. And we did that to address the contested space domain. But we've never gone back since then to comprehensively review how the roles and responsibilities should shift across the entire enterprise. And so in the meantime, other services are rightly developing capabilities that can affect space, missile defense, electronic warfare, sensing. We're just now talking about strike capabilities. But the risk is that without sort of clear guidance and lanes in the road, we end up either with duplication, with gaps, or even conflicting effects. And I think that's problematic. I don't believe a roles and mission review is about turf per se. This is not a chest beating contest. That's not the point. But it's about ensuring that everyone understands when they're supporting space superiority, what they're responsible for, and then who is in charge of ensuring those effects are happening appropriately timed with the appropriate amount of energy and heft, if you will.
Yeah, I think there's two sides of this. One is the development of capabilities, and the other is the employment of capabilities, right?
I like how you break that down,
Right.
yeah.
So on the development side, the Space Force leadership has the responsibility to be the force design architect for space for the armed forces and the DoD's Joint Space Requirements Integrator. So the Space Forces really should be leading the effort in terms of who's developing what capabilities, and are we going to develop them jointly, or is this a standalone Space Force or a standalone Navy or a standalone Army or a standalone Air Force capability that then can be brought to bear later?
What's the relationship with other DoD agencies? Space Force and spacey things.
I think that's a larger discussion.
Okay.
But if we just talk about the Title X responsibilities
Yeah, all right,
and
fair.
employing force, I think we can maybe bend the discussion a little bit better. And then once those capabilities are developed, whether they're developed jointly or within a specific service line, it's the employment of those. And this is where General Mastalir, I think, is going to have a lot more to say in terms of how it's happening today. Are we providing and presenting forces from all of the services that Space Force, at Space Command can then employ to achieve space superiority?
Sir?
Yeah. Thanks for that, Charles. Couldn't agree more. What struck me as Boots was making her opening comments is the best time, to stand up a Space Force, you could argue, was 2007 after the PRC tested a kinetic ASAT and created thousands of pieces of debris. The second best time was 2019 when we did, and happy birthday to the Space Force. It turns 6 years old tomorrow. My point, I guess, is that time is one of the challenges. Is as we develop capabilities and as the Space Force stands up units and as Space Command continues to mature, this roles and responsibilities functions review has to occur, and it has to occur on a regular basis, because these organizations are so new that they are growing into their respective roles and responsibilities every day. For example, you alluded to the fact that I stood up Space Forces Indo-Pacific prior to this assignment, and that was the very first Space Force service component assigned to a combatant command. It was followed by Space Forces Central and Space Forces Europe, Africa, and after that, Space Forces Space. Most recently, and I mean just weeks ago, we stood up Space Forces South, and Space Forces North is now in the queue to stand up in the first part of 2026. My point is that these are service organizations, and as Guardians are assigned to these components, they are going to become experts in joint warfighting simply because they serve alongside other warfighters from other services. And they're also in a position to educate the joint force on their respective space dependencies. This is why every joint force commander wants a space component assigned to their headquarters. Now, at Space Command, we are focused on executing operations in the space domain to ensure that we maintain space superiority. And in doing so, we have to ensure that we can deliver space effects, defend those space capabilities that are delivering those space effects, and then defeat our adversaries who might use space to attack the joint force. As we mature and as the Space Force components mature, we're going to see that various roles and responsibilities and missions may shift. For example, electronic warfare is a ground-based space electronic warfare is a mission area that is probably better suited to be executed by the Space Force components assigned in those various combatant commands. Why? Because the effects are regional. You are trying to disrupt your opponent's communication links, and those opponents are right there in that AOR with you. Whereas when we talk about the other threads, like defending space capabilities or defeating adversaries' space capabilities, that's going to be inherently a space command mission, because those effects occur in the space domain in our area of responsibility. So we have to continually review these roles and responsibilities, and which is why I think Boot's point is so salient.
Yeah, General Mastalir, just a quick anecdote on the evolution of thinking about this. I'm going to flash back 20 years when I was at Strategic Command. We had the responsibility for the space mission at the time, and I was leading the effort to establish the Space Control Joint Capabilities document. And part of that process was, what are all the space capabilities we have? And so we did a call, and we said, okay, Air Force, Army, Navy, what capabilities do you have that can support space control? The Navy's answer was, we don't do space control, we do fleet defense. Okay, but you're having an effect in a potential space domain. Don't you want to contribute that to this discussion? No, it's fleet defense. I'm like, okay. Now, I know thinking has evolved over the years, and maybe they don't have that view, and maybe we've clarified some lines of responsibility. But even today, I know that the Army's developing capabilities that they consider supporting ground maneuver, but they achieve a space effect on space assets. And so
it's because they don't want to lose the tasking authority.
They don't want to lose the tasking authority. There could be a variety of reasons, but the Army does point out that they are presenting those forces to U.S. Space Command for employment, and there's some sort of arrangement where certain capabilities are commanded and controlled through U.S. Space Command and others via other combatant commands. And so I just think that has to continually evolve our thinking. And as General Mastalir pointed out, we have to periodically reevaluate those roles and responsibilities. I don't know, General Mastalir, how is it working today?
So today, it really depends on, again, the level of maturation in the various components. So as the Space Force service components, in many cases, they're still under-resourced and undermanned. And that's just a function of being brand new and the Space Force needing to perform its organized, training, equip functions, which it's doing, and prioritizing the assignment of Guardians to those units. As those units become more capable, we're seeing that those combatant commanders are willing and able to take on more responsibilities. What I always tell folks here at U.S. Space Command is there is one mission, when you think about what Space Command does, there is one mission that really only Space Command can do, and that's that orbital warfare mission, which is, number one, necessary because the nations like the PRC and Russia are building weapons in space that we have to defend against. And number two, they're using space assets to aid their long-range targeting of U.S. and allied forces. So being able to defend in our AOR and defeat the adversary in our AOR, that is something that really only U.S. Space Command can do. And that's what we're wholly focused on today.
General Mastalir, I'm really glad that you brought that up about the focus of Space Command being orbital warfare. But, Boots notes in her paper how the responsibility for space activities isn't really exclusive to the military, but also includes elements of the intelligence community. Can you elaborate on this relationship for our audience?
Oh, 100%. The intelligence, and let me just say, the intelligence community has really stepped up over the last 10 years to ensure, number one, that we have the foundational, but also the exquisite intelligence that we need to execute those missions. And the relationship between U.S. Space Command and the IC, the intelligence community, I think is stronger today than it's ever been. Now, broadly speaking, and I'm not getting into doctrinal definitions, but broadly speaking, space operations is both a producer. We produce intelligence. It's an inherent function or mission set. of space capabilities. But we also consume intelligence. So, think space domain awareness. And U.S. Space Command relies on this intelligence so that we can better understand the threat environment in our AOR. And I remind everyone, the AOR, like I think maybe Boots mentioned, the first instantiation of U.S. Space Command didn't have an area of responsibility. Ours is defined at 100 kilometers and above. We rely on intelligence to better understand the threat environment in the space domain in our AOR. And if called upon, we're going to need that exquisite intelligence to be able to deny or disrupt long-range enemy kill chains. We also have to understand and maintain an awareness of the adversary's pattern of behavior in space. And why is this important? Because when it changes, it may be an indication or warning of potential hostile intent. And indications and warnings are, every military commander will tell you the importance of INW, indications and warnings of what the adversary is planning to do. So for us to be able to preserve our freedom of maneuver in space, INW is very important. Now, at Space Command, we have, within our J2, we have quite a few IC partners embedded, and they bring tremendous space expertise. So we rely on them routinely. I'd say that the J2s and the other combatant commands, based on my experience, they are continuing to mature as well in terms of their space expertise. And again, the activation of Space Force service components in those combatant commands and the presence of our GIST members in some cases can augment the intelligence activities that need to take place.
Boots?
Nothing to add. He's got it.
Okay.
Perfect.
So what about doctrinal changes? I mean, we've talked a lot about the evolution of the space domain, roles and missions, but we probably also need to talk about doctrinal changes if we're going to achieve space superiority, so really codify everything that we're learning. Boots?
So I'm thinking about this in two ways, in two different sort of lines of effort, if you will. The first thing is that from a solely space perspective, I do believe that between U.S. Space Force and U.S. Space Command, that we're really moving out on a new doctrinal for orbital warfare, for how we do business in space. I really think that's happening well. Where I do think we need some work, though, is when we look at it from a larger perspective in the context of all the military services and all of the combatant commands, because I think our doctrine there still reflects a world where space is mostly permissive. And so these concepts like space control and counter space, they absolutely exist. And the space guys get it, but they're not fully integrated into the joint operational thinking. For example, in the way air superiority or sea control are, the way those things happen. So I think it needs to reflect the reality that U.S. Space Command may be the supported command, as we've talked about, certainly in certain phases of conflict, and that other forces will conduct operations specifically to enable space superiority. Because it's not just about how we're going to fight. Doctrine also shapes how people think. And right now we're lagging. That's lagging. The thinking is lagging the threat just a little bit.
So that really begs the question then of education. Joe Mastalir, I'd like to get your thoughts on some of the educational reforms that Boots outlined in her paper and how they might overcome this old think.
Yeah, so Lucky, first let me say that service is right doctrine, okay? So, and the Space Force has made significant progress over the last 6 years. And as Space Force service components, that's that warfighting organization that the service provides to the combatant commanders, as they continue to mature, they will continually refine Space Force doctrine. And this is true for all the services. The Air Force writes air doctrine and et cetera. Now, this is not to say that combatant commands don't play a role, because we do. For one, we execute named operations, we campaign, and we exercise a lot. And when we're not exercising, we're planning. Joint doctrine generally draws upon service doctrine and must evolve to reflect the reality that we may need to fight a war that extends into space. So let me talk about one point in particular. When you think about joint warfighting functions, think about maneuver. Maneuver is a joint warfighting function, and U.S. Space Command forces must be able to achieve a position of advantage. Another one, sustainment. And when we talk about sustainment, we're thinking resupply of fuel, munitions, et cetera, equipment maintenance. And the relationship between these two functions is not new in the terrestrial domains. It's inextricably linked. But in the space domain, we too have to evolve the doctrine to better understand the impact of these warfighting functions. For example, fuel limitations are restraints to operational planning. A planner would never consider using B-2s out of the continental U.S. to strike targets in Iran if the Air Force didn't have tankers. It just would never occur to you. That's not a possibility. The same is true in the space domain. So we have to start thinking about these joint warfighting functions and ensure that the doctrine reflects what we need to be able to effectively fight in the joint all-domain environment, which includes the space domain.
So both of you talked a lot about thinking and how warfighters and planners think and how commanders think. So, sir, this sort of begs a question of education. So I'd really like to get your thoughts on some of the educational reforms that Boots outlined in her paper and how they might overcome just this old think. How do we need to think for the future?
One of the things that's occurring in all of the combatant commands, and it's in part because of our presence with our GIST, our Joint Integrated Space Teams, as well as the Space Force service components, is an education process across the joint force. And as a combatant command, because we participate in these Tier 1 exercises, the education piece is critical so that other joint force commanders understand, and the units assigned to them understand those space dependencies. To Boot's point, space superiority is going to require all of the combatant commands at times prioritize their military operations to ensure that we maintain space superiority. And that education process occurs in those training, in the TTXs, the tabletop exercises that we do, as well as the operational planning. Never before have we had such a close coupling of operational planners with members from Space Command and the other geographic combatant commands than we do right now. That is an ongoing process, and there's a great deal of education that takes place and a great deal of learning that takes place through those processes.
What strikes me is there's like 3 different ways people learn, right? You can learn by reading, you can learn by watching, you can learn by doing. And there's a time and place for all of that. And through our PME programs and things, there's an opportunity for people to learn and adjust their thinking by reading or maybe watching. But the type of exercises that General Mastalir is talking about, that's really where you're going to do it, and you're going to ingrain it more deeply into the thinking of everybody that's participating in that, and they'll take those lessons back to their units and continue to expand that thinking to a broader audience. So I think that's a great way to infuse new ways of thinking.
Charles, I'm so glad you brought that up because this is a transformation that has to occur now. And many of our service members across the department, they've been through their PME. We don't have the opportunity to indoctrinate them either at their accessions or some of the really pivotal points in their professional military education. So how do we continue to ensure that they are coming along with this transformation? As you mentioned, by doing, right? I think that's pretty clear. If you get schwacked in a major exercise because we didn't achieve space superiority, that's going to be a pretty pivotal moment for you.
Yeah, a significant emotional event, I think we used to call it, right? And now you go, oh, wait a minute, maybe I need that other service to take care of that threat because it just took me out. Or maybe I need that space capability more than I thought I did. And so that'll just reinforce what's learned. And we also have to remember that there are people that are done with their PME, but one of the things as a military professional that was drilled into my head, and I firmly believe, is you never stop learning. So there's always an opportunity to learn more, even if you're past senior level education.
Yep.
But we also have to remember that the military is a constantly revolving organization where new members are coming on board, and we can get them from the beginning, and we can get them at different stages of their careers.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So moving on to capabilities, Boots, I want to bring you back to the conversation because you call out several areas where investment is needed. domain awareness, command control, communications, and engaging with the orbital, terrestrial, and link segments of the space systems. So how does competition stack up across these different areas? Are we ahead of our adversaries in some, but falling behind in others?
So I think we are really strong in terms of our actual technical sophistication and our innovation. I do think we lag a little bit in our integration scale, maybe a little bit of resilience. China in particular, they have designed so many of their systems to operate through disruption. And we tend to design our systems, again, older systems that we're still using because they are amazing and they last so long, assuming that the disruption wouldn't happen, right? So that's a different context going into it. So in some areas, I think we're ahead, but in others, we are actually playing catch up, especially in this cross-domain integration. Now, the good news is that we don't need to start from scratch. We already have much of what we need. We just have to put more effort in connecting and integrating all of it into operations.
Sir, if you're going to do a net assessment of U.S. space capabilities and adversary space capabilities, what would you add to what Boots had shared?
So, number one, our space lift capacity is unmatched by anyone in the world, and it is the envy of all nations. I think clearly we maintain, overmatch in the space domain, but we can't rest on our laurels because the PRC is advancing their capabilities at a breathtakingly fast pace, is the way General Whiting describes it. So we have to continue. One of the things, two other advantages that we have is a really robust commercial space industry. And so when we think about things like our Joint Commercial Operations Cell, which is really a very groundbreaking, innovative approach to use commercial sensors to build that space domain awareness sight picture that we need. The other is our ability to pull in allies and partners. And there are a lot of nations that have earmarked significant portions of their budget to invest in space capabilities. And fortunately for us, they're our allies, and they want to, continue to fight alongside of us and invest in ways that are complementary, so that we can bring a allied perspective to how we develop future space capabilities. And that's somewhat of a departure from what we used to do in national security space, which was kind of a little bit go it alone. And we are completely changing that paradigm as we move forward. So commercial and allies and partners, I think, are key parts of that net assessment that contribute to our overmatch.
What about terrestrial capabilities? Space superiority requires that domain awareness and command and control. How are terrestrial capabilities standing up?
We have a robust set of terrestrial capabilities, around the world. And again, in part because we have so many allies and partners that are willing to, support, U.S. military operations. We talk about basing opportunities. And when you have a lot of partners and a lot of allies, you have a lot of basing opportunities to proliferate those terrestrial capabilities.
Sounds a little bit like dynamic space operations, right, Charles?
Well, yeah, we do have options, right? And so that's great. And General Mastalir comments about the commercial capabilities and the international partnerships. That's absolutely spot on. I would suggest, though, that we have superior space capabilities today. We have better PNT, better ISR, better satellite communications, better missile warning. But I think China in particular has at least more counter space capabilities than we have, because we had tried to preserve space as a peaceful domain for a long time, where they were advancing more rapidly. And so I think that's an area that we have to defend against and be able to counter through cross-domain operations. We don't have to necessarily defend against every anti-satellite missile that they might launch, especially if we can destroy those anti-satellite missiles before they launch.
So we've had a really robust conversation. Sir, what I'd like to finish on is discussions about exercises with our own forces, joint force exercises, and also those with our allies and partners. How can we better integrate the variety of players that really all have a stake in space superiority?
Yeah, so the Space Command is making huge progress in this area. You know, the operational significance of a named operation like what we have with MNF-OOD, a Multinational Forces Operation Olympic Defender, the significance of a named operation cannot be overstated. And when we talk about normalizing the space domain and how we intend to, you know, deliver effects, defend against counter space threats, and defeat adversaries' use of space, having a named operation provides a framework that opens a lot of doors for you. We've had already now several operations, one with the UK, one more recently with France, where we're doing first ever coordinated satellite maneuvers, demonstrating not only the alliance's prowess in space, but the readiness to conduct dynamic, responsible, and integrated space operations at the time and place of our choosing. So doing rendezvous proximity operations with our allies, it's something that our adversaries notice. And again, it further strengthens this narrative that we are maturing in the space domain very, very rapidly, and doing so with our allies and partners in a way that our adversaries cannot.
I mean, we have to recognize that if space superiority is always scripted as on, we learn nothing, right? When it's contested, we learn very quickly what actually works. Remember that exercises are how we turn theory into operational competence.
Oh, I like that. I like that. And it also reinforces everything from the doctrine, the roles and responsibilities, the planning, the education. I mean, that's really how we get this entire cultural shift so that we have truly cross-domain space operations.
Exactly. It's the reps and sets that we need to get it right.
Yep.
Sir, thank you so much. I mean, ending on that note, it really heartens me about our departments and our allies and partners and our commercial space partners. So thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for such a great conversation. General Mastalir, I'm so thrilled that you were here. Space superiority really is a team sport, and we just have to start treating it that way.
And General Mastalir, thanks again for joining us. And Jen, congratulations again on the paper. And Lucky, it's always great to chat with you. Thanks, everybody. Have a great Spacepower Day.
And with that, I'd like to extend a big thank you to our guests for joining in today's conversation. I'd also like to extend a big thank you to you, our listeners, for your continued support and for tuning into today's show. If you like what you heard today, don't forget to hit that like button or follow or subscribe to the Aerospace Advantage. You can also leave a comment to let us know what you think about our show or areas that you would like us to explore further. As always, you can join in on the conversation by following the Mitchell Institute on X, Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn, and you can always find us at mitchellaerospacepower.org. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great Aerospace Power kind of day. See you next time.